They said he was just a dog walker, but Marshall Cruz was not walking a dog. He was walking grief. Every morning, rain or shine, he circled the wrought iron fence of the Langley estate with a leash hanging loose in his hand, the collar clipped to nothing, swaying gently in the air. Neighbors whispered. Some laughed, some filmed him from behind their curtains, thinking he'd lost his mind. What they didn't know was that Marshall was being paid well to do exactly that, to walk a ghost. It began with an envelope slipped through the slot of his shared apartment door. 1 hour a day. No questions, same route, no interruptions, 150 per walk. At first, he thought it was a scam, but the address was real. The money showed up in his account. And on the second morning, the front door creaked open just enough to reveal a woman with silver hair pinned neatly and a stare that seemed to weigh every bone in his body. Same time tomorrow, she said before disappearing. Marshall didn't need to ask, he needed the money. Ever since he came out at 22, his parents had cut all ties. He'd been couch surfing, cleaning apartments, and walking dogs that weren't his. He'd learned to live on silence, both his own and the silence others offered when they wanted him to disappear. But this job was different. There was no no expectations, no questions, only the leash, the route, and the woman in the window who always watched him from the same armchair. Her name was Eliza Langley, though she never introduced herself. Marshall had looked her up online, a retired psychologist, philanthropist, and founder of Haven North, a shelter for LGBTQ+ youth. Once praised by the mayor, now run by a board that had slowly phased her out. She was a woman with a legacy, yet she lived alone, surrounded by decaying roses and framed awards that hadn't been dusted in years. One morning, after weeks of silent loops, he returned from the walk to find the front door slightly ajar. This time she was standing behind it. "Come in," she said, voice dry like leaves in autumn. She motioned toward the kitchen without making eye contact. On the counter sat 2 mugs of tea, one already steaming for him. He didn't speak, not until she finally asked, "What do you see out there?" Marshall hesitated, then replied honestly, "A neighborhood trying not to look at me." She smiled faintly, "Then keep walking." From that day on, the routine began to shift. Still the leash, still the walk, but now tea afterward. No conversation at first, just the clinking of spoons and the occasional cough. He noticed how she winced when she stood, how the mug trembled slightly in her grip, yet she never asked for help and he never offered respect. He learned was not always in grand gestures. Sometimes it was knowing when to let someone carry their own pain in peace. But he also noticed something else. Her house was full of photos, but no family. No guests, no holiday bomb. Just a framed collar with a faded tag that read, Bishop. The leash matched the one he walked every day. Marshall didn't ask, but he knew. And though he was still being paid to walk an invisible dog, something in him started to shift. Because someone for the first time in a long while was watching him walk. And not to mock, but to remember. He wasn't just a dog walker anymore. He was becoming something else entirely, though he didn't have a word for it yet, and neither did she. If stories like this move you, if you believe in the quiet power of small kindnesses and the people we overlook, subscribe to Heart Stories for more real emotional journeys that stay with you. Marshall never asked to stay, but by the 3rd week of tea, Eliza began leaving the front door unlocked before his walk ended. It wasn't an invitation, it was trust, wordless and fragile. He began to take off his shoes at the door, wash his hands without being told, and sit in the same chair across from hers by the window, where the late sun bled through lace curtains. No television, no music, just the sounds of a house that had grown used to solitude. She started talking in fragments, never about herself, never about the house or why she chose him. Instead, she'd toss out questions like pebbles into a still lake, watching how he rippled. Why do people think suffering makes you interesting? Do you think memory lives in objects? And once, after a long silence, she asked, "Have you ever been owned?" Marshall looked up, startled, but her eyes stayed fixed on the garden. She wasn't looking for an answer, she was offering one of her own. From then on, the leash he walked with felt heavier, not with weight, but with meaning. It wasn't just a ritual, it was aligned to something sacred. He realized the route had been meticulously chosen, a loop that passed an old church, a closed-down bookstore, and a rusting park bench that had lost its plaque. Places that must have meant something once. He began taking mental notes. How Eliza's breathing grew more labored with each visit. How her teacups remained spotless, but her mail piled untouched. There was no family name on the envelopes, only resident. One Tuesday, It rained harder than usual. He hesitated at the gate, expecting the walk to be canceled, but the door creaked and opened anyway, and Eliza stood in her slippers, arms crossed. He liked the rain, she said. So Marshall walked soaked to the bone leash, dragging behind him like a tale of devotion. When he returned, she was waiting in the kitchen with dry clothes, his size, already folded. That day, she said something she never had before. Stay a little longer. And so he did. The stories began to flow. She told him about Bishop, the old German shepherd she'd rescued during her divorce. How he used to wait by the window when she came home late from the shelter. How he barked every time someone praised her, but never wagged his tail at anyone but her secretary. He could smell hypocrisy, she said. Marshall learned that the Haven North shelter was her life's work, but after her cancer diagnosis, the board had quietly shifted her role to founder emeritus. A polite way of saying obsolete. They wanted the story, she said, not the storyteller. She never said it with bitterness, only weariness, like someone who had accepted being erased as long as the mission lived on. But Marshall noticed she never mentioned visiting the shelter again. Not once. One afternoon, he asked if she wanted him to take her there. She blinked surprised, then said, "No, that place doesn't have a heartbeat anymore." The next morning when Marshall arrived, the door was open but silent. No tea, no Eliza by the window. He walked through the house calling gently, found her asleep in the study chair. Breathing shallow, he called 911, stayed with her as the ambulance came, held her hand without permission. At the hospital, they asked him if he was family. He hesitated, then said, "I'm the one she trusts." That night, he returned to the Langley house alone. The hallway felt colder, the garden darker. In the study, the leather chair still held her shape, and on the side table was a manila envelope with his name on it. Inside were 2 keys, a handwritten note, and a drawing. The note said, "You kept walking. That's why you'll know what to do when it's time to stop." The drawing was of a house, but not this one. It was a rough sketch of something larger. Busier, a place where no one would ever be invisible again. Marshall sat there for hours. No leash, no tea, no footsteps. Just the awareness that something had begun long before he arrived, and somehow he had become part of its final sentence. Eliza never came back home. She spent her final days in a private palliative care unit tucked behind a church she once funded, but hadn't stepped inside for years. Marshall visited daily, bringing a different flower each time, sunflowers, lilies, sometimes wild weeds plucked from the sidewalk. She never commented, but once he caught her fingers tracing a petal, long after she thought he'd left. She spoke less, slept more, but when she did open her eyes, they locked onto his like she was trying to memorize. One afternoon, she whispered, "Don't let them turn it into a brand." Marshall didn't ask what she meant. He already knew. The house stood quiet. Marshall returned each day after the hospital to check on it, though he had no right to. He watered the plants, sorted the unopened mail, and sat in the same chair by the window. His leash replaced by silence, his walk by waiting. When Eliza passed, it wasn't Marshall who got the call. It was the lawyer Marshall learned through a voicemail. "Mrs. Langley named you in her final directive. Please attend the reading of the will." The day of the reading, the Langley house transformed. Polished black cars lined the driveway. Strangers in tailored suits stepped out, pretending to remember the place. Most hadn't visited in years. A few had never been there at all, but all came hungry. Marshall arrived in a plain sweater, still slightly damp from the walkover. He kept to the corner, watching as people discussed assets like appetizers, the chandelier in the dining room, the paintings in the hallway, the land's redevelopment potential. Then the lawyer, a thin man with wire-frame glasses and a slow, deliberate voice, called for silence. He opened a thick folder, glanced briefly at Marshall, then began. "Mrs. Eliza Langley leaves the following." The first few items went as expected: certain antiques to museums, a modest trust to the local animal rescue, a donation to a community library. Then came the moment that stopped the room cold. "To Marshall Cruz," the lawyer read, "I leave the Langley estate in full, the Haven North endowment funds previously held in trust, and the rights to all architectural plans stored in the cedar chest in my study. He alone is tasked with executing my final project, the establishment of Haven South, a continuation of my life's work to be built in any city of his choosing, preferably where the forgotten outnumber the favored." The silence was feral. It didn't breathe. It hissed one relative. An older man with a wine-stained tie stood abruptly. "Who is this boy?" "The dog walker. You're saying she gave him everything." The lawyer nodded. Correct. He is also named executor. There is no contest clause in place. Any challenge will forfeit your share. A woman gasped. Another whispered, she's lost her mind at the end. But the lawyer continued unfazed. There is a letter attached addressed to Mr. Cruz. He handed it to Marshall. It was handwritten, faint and slanted. Marshall, if you're reading this, then they're reading it too. I hope you're still standing. I picked you not because you were perfect, but because you didn't flinch when you were invisible. You walked anyway. You showed up, and more than that, you stayed. This place was never about money. It was about presence. Build it where you wish. Let them call it madness. I call it legacy. Marshall didn't cry, not there. Not in front of people who had called him the boy who walked nothing. But when the lawyer handed him a second envelope, this one containing the architectural blueprints Eliza had drawn by hand, his fingers trembled. On the bottom of the final page was one word in bold cursive, Haven. That night he walked the route again. The same empty leash in hand, but this time the invisible weight had a name. And this time he chose the direction. The land was cheap, the air was thick, and the town of Baton Rouge didn't care who you were, as long as you didn't make noise. That's why Marshall chose it. He had studied the blueprints night after night, tracing Eliza's loops of ink like a prayer. They weren't just designs. They were memories mapped into walls, a reading room that faced morning light, bedrooms with double locks for safety, a hidden garden for those who needed to disappear without vanishing. Every detail had purpose, every line a confession. But building anything from scratch was never just about money. Even when you had enough of it. He had the deed, he had the funds. What he didn't have was permission, not legal, emotional. The local zoning board questioned his intentions. Some church leaders murmured about that kind of shelter. Contractors backed out after seeing the project's name, Haven South. He heard slurs thrown softly behind his back. The gay millionaire with a dead lady's money. He's not even blood. Another outsider with a savior complex. Marshall said nothing. Instead, he hired people no one else would. A trans carpenter who hadn't touched wood in 10 years. A teen from the shelter's food pantry who sketched murals in secret. An older gay couple who once designed stage sets but were now driving Ubers to afford rent. They worked quietly with music playing through shared headphones and lunch breaks under scaffolding. No titles, no suits, just hands building something real. And as the walls began to rise, so did whispers of change. A local coffee shop offered to cater the opening. A librarian donated over 200 books. A once silent city block began to hum again, cautiously, then confidently. But not everyone celebrated 3 nights before the scheduled ribbon cutting. Someone broke in. They didn't steal anything, they didn't have to. They spray painted the front entrance with crude messages, symbols of hate, and one phrase that stopped Marshall cold: "You don't belong here." It was written across the spot where the center's name would go. He didn't cry. He just stood there watching the letters drip in red and black. The others wanted to call the police, make statements, demand answers. Marshall refused. "We rebuild," he said, "but we don't erase it." The next day he painted over most of the graffiti, all except the phrase. That part he framed in a transparent panel mounted above the new welcome desk with a plaque underneath that read, "This is what they said." We opened anyway. The media caught wind of it. A local journalist wrote a piece titled, "The Boy Who Walked a Ghost and Built a Home." It spread online, donations surged. Former residents of Haven North, kids who once found shelter under Eliza's care, sent letters of gratitude. Some even came to visit. One left a note at the front desk. "I didn't think people like us lived long enough to give back. You proved me wrong." As the day of the grand opening arrived, Marshall stood alone in the back office. He pulled out the last envelope Eliza had left, unopened until that moment. Inside was a photograph. It was of her and Bishop. He was a younger dog then, tongue out, eyes bright. On the back of the photo was a single sentence in her looping hand. "I built the first home for him. You build the last one for them." Marshall placed the photo on the wall behind his desk. Then he stepped out into the sun, where a small crowd had gathered under a banner that read, "Haven South, a place to stay, a place to start." There was no ribbon, no celebrity guest, just people, survivors, strangers, chosen families. And one boy who once walked an invisible dog, now walking into the future Eliza trusted him to carry. Years passed, but Haven South never grew quiet. The sound of healing is not loud. It's in the shuffle of slippers across a hallway at midnight, the exhale of someone sleeping safely for the first time in weeks, the laughter of strangers becoming housemates. Then family. Marshall never called himself a director. He preferred custodian, because that's what he did. He tended to the visions someone else planted and let others bloom from it. He kept the routines Eliza once gave him. Every morning before staff arrived, he walked the perimeter of the building. Not with a leash, not anymore, but with the same rhythm in his steps, a silent loop of remembrance. Some staff thought it was a security check. Others said it was meditative, but a few knew better. They walked with him, sometimes no words needed. One spring morning, as purple flowers cracked through the gravel, by the gate, a young boy named Felix arrived with a social worker. 11, skinny, barely taller than the doorknob, and completely mute. He wore oversized sleeves that covered his wrists and stared down as he walked. He didn't respond when spoken to, didn't eat the first 2 days, and only left his room after dark. Marshall didn't push. Instead, he left a leash outside the boy's door. No explanation, just placed it there, looped and waiting. Days later, it disappeared. Weeks later, Felix began walking behind him in the mornings, 3 steps back, head down, never speaking, never breaking stride, but he was there. Every single morning, Mr. Shine. It took 3 months before Felix said his first words. He was sitting across from Marshall, stirring his cereal, and quietly muttered, "You're not like the others," Marshall asked gently. "Why do you think that?" The boy shrugged. "You walk like you remember something." Marshall didn't answer. But that night, he placed the old leash, Eliza's leash, Bishop's leash, into a glass case by the entrance, beneath a new plaque that read, "In memory of those who walked beside us, even when we couldn't see them." The center expanded over time. More room, a mobile health clinic, a garden named after the founding team. But the heart remained unchanged. One afternoon, Marshall received a letter, no return address. Inside was a short message. "I used to sit on the board of Haven North. We were wrong. She saw something in you. I see it now too. Thank you for keeping her alive." He folded it carefully, placed it in a wooden box of small things that mattered, a drawing from one of the kids, a ribbon from the first Pride March they hosted, and a paper napkin with Eliza's handwriting that simply read, "Don't flinch." On the 5th anniversary of the opening, a local news team did a feature. They asked Marshall for a statement. He stood in front of the camera framed by the garden and the mural of names painted by former residents. He said, "I didn't build this place to be seen. I built it because someone once saw me. She gave me a leash and asked me to walk in circles, and somehow that became a straight path forward. I hope everyone watching remembers this. You don't have to save the world, just make space for someone in it." The clip went viral, not because it was flashy, but because it was honest. And because in a world where so many are told they're too much, too different, too late, this was a reminder that legacies aren't built in bloodlines, they're built in footsteps. Do you know someone who walked beside you even when the world didn't? Tell us in the comments. Subscribe to Heart Stories to never miss a story that honors those who chose love over legacy, presence over performance, and taught us all how to build something that lasts.